Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Pedophile Huntress. We're here tonight with one common goal, that you be encouraged in heart and united in love. Tonight, the guest that I have with me is Priscilla. I'm going to let her introduce herself. She does a lot of advocacy work, and her story is very interesting. I actually came across her. I follow Real Talk Kim. I think she's an amazing person. And I ran across Priscilla in the mix of all that. And so she agreed to be with us here tonight. It's really exciting to have her. And Priscilla, I just kind of want you to bring us into your advocacy work first, and then we'll get into your very interesting story. So if you can just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do for work, which is so cool. I love it.
Yes, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me and shout out to Real Talk Kim. I absolutely love her as well. Super excited to have her next month speaking at a conference that I'm leading called Survivor Healing from Trauma, which really
Love
just
that.
kind of goes into like what I do for a living. I was a victim of sexual assault, which I know we'll talk a little bit more later. But God really has just done a lot of healing in me, and I can confidently say that I've gone from being a victim to being a victor. And now I get to help other victims who've been affected by crime, specifically sexual assault. But our organization that I work for is called Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, which is under the umbrella of Alliance for Safety and Justice. And what sort of led me there was really crazy how God kind of orchestrated all of this. But I shared my story on social media, gosh, well over 10 years ago, and just did not know that it was going to sort of create the platform that it did as far as like creating the community of finding other survivors that also were sexually abused,
Oh,
specifically
I love
by
it.
family members. And I
Mhm.
really just was like, God, I don't know what you want me to do, but whatever it is you want me to do, I want to be obedient. And I started just by word of mouth going with other victims and survivors to court and just sort of became a community court advocate. And then I
Mhm.
started working in the medical advocacy, coming alongside victims who were specifically raped or molested. And I basically became their support system during the time where it's um, very vulnerable for them and very difficult. This is when they're getting their rape kit done. They're having to
Right.
be interviewed by police officers. And I just know like what my experience was. And I really wish that I would have had someone like be by my side during my difficult season and experience. So after medical advocacy, I just started speaking at different places, whether it be conferences or um, even like our National Guard, our with our local law enforcement, like whether we were discussing like prevention and what things to look for and how can we be a support system, and what really came from my own experience of what I wish I would have had or what I wish wouldn't have
Mhm.
happened. And what ended up happening was I had a friend that basically knew of our vice president of the organization that I work for now. And she was like, you really need to meet this person named Oswald. And they told Oswald, you really need to meet Priscilla.
I
So we
love
met,
it.
and he happened to be the vice president of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And we both shared our stories. Like he was a gun violence survivor, and
Oh,
I
wow.
was a rape victim and survivor. And we really shared even though our experiences were so different, we really shared a common goal that we wanted. One was that what happened to us, we didn't want to happen to anyone else, but we
Mhm.
also both really cared about everybody involved, which means the person that's being affected by the crime and the person that was actually causing crime and harm and trauma. And we'll get into a little bit more later of like why that is. But
Right.
he basically asked me a question at the end of our conversation. He's like, Priscilla, like, you're doing really good things. And he felt very confident in the work that he was doing. He's like, but he asked me, he said, if there's one thing that you could do that you're not doing, what would it be? And I said, honestly, like, I've always wanted to work in legislation, change laws for victims and
Mhm.
survivors, and really meet the needs of victims and survivors in like such an impactful way because legislation is where everything is at, like where all the laws are made, and it
Right?
impacts millions of people. And so he smiled so big and he was like, well, he's like, this is what our organization does. I started volunteering. I became a member. Then I became a chapter coordinator. I became the statewide manager for the organization in the state of Michigan. And I actually have just now taken on a new role called manager of partners, where I'll be traveling across the country to really build relationships and find organizations who really are aligned with our organization, the ones that are the boots on the ground working with victims and survivors who've been affected by crime. And what I would say
That
about,
is awesome.
yeah,
Is
no,
is this a national organization or is it based out of Michigan?
no, it's a national organization. Our headquarters are
Super cool.
actually in California. So if anyone wants to get involved in the work that we do, they can go to
Say
CSSJ.
yes.
Yeah, CSSJ.
Say the name. I'm
C
sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, it's okay. CSSJ.org.
It's
Um,
awesome.
they can become a member and they can choose how they want to get involved. They too can get involved in legislation. We have an incredible opportunity for people to share their stories. We media train, we legislative train. Even though we're not a direct service, we really, really hone in our relationships with other organizations that serve victims and survivors. We cannot do the work that we do without victims and survivors. But one of the most unique things about our organization is that all of our bills are from victims and survivors themselves. Um, and it's important to note that there's two divisions to our organization. I don't like to say sides because we don't work against each other. We have the survivor division, which is victims who've been affected by crime. And then we have the time done division, and that is for those who've actually done time for committing a crime. And what's
Mm,
really, really unique is that for over 10 years, I really felt alone until I found this organization. Because one, they don't talk about this in the churches. They don't give you the resources you need in the churches when it comes to this work.
right.
I feel like a lot of times,
Right.
and I'm not against prayer and all the spiritual aspects of what Jesus does for us and brings healing. He has 100% done that for me, but some of the stuff that we do are also more on the practical side of things when it comes to someone's healing. And I just,
I'm so thankful for that.
yeah,
I'm so thankful for that.
me too. So some of the things that our organization, I think the special piece is that, we have our policy retreats where we bring victims and survivors from all walks of life, from all different experiences, whether that's gun violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and we find out from
Mm,
them through their experiences, what were the barriers that they faced? What were the things that, they wish they had? What were some of the things that they wish didn't take place? And we start drafting bills that way, and it goes through a whole process. And we were just
oh,
talking
it's
about this yesterday.
awesome.
Yeah, can you imagine like being a victim and
It's
being able to feel
fantastic.
through action and say, actually,
Right.
I was a part of that law that changed? Or, sometimes it's
That's
creating laws,
beautiful.
and other times it's changing ones that are just like outdated and just need to be
Hmm.
changed. So that's
Oh,
the work that I
Priscilla,
do.
that is just wonderful. Anybody listening, I think all of us, I'm going to go check out that organization. I hadn't heard of it. I love these kinds of things. I've worked in law firms for my entire career, almost 40 years now, and you have to change it there. And it's
Yeah,
these crimes are some of the crimes that nobody likes. Nobody likes these crimes. And in childhood, they are crimes. This is not a family matter. These are crimes. And so I just think it's such really cool work that you do,
thank
which
you.
kind of brings us right into your story. So I also heard some of your story and went through your page, and I always think it's so cool. I believe with all of my heart that God is rising up his own warriors to come and fight that. And you're absolutely right. You can't just throw a scripture at it or do one prayer. God wants to come into those recesses, those hidden dark places that we were told to keep quiet, and he walks right in with us and heals us and brings us out. So I agree with you. And I agree. I mean, I believe in counselors. I had my own counselor for many years, and I know many Christians don't. So this is beautiful. But your story began very early in life, right? I don't really know how this happened, but I know that I read your father was a pastor. These kinds of things are so ordinary in the world of incest, quite honestly. It's very strange how I always think that the spirit of incest sits right behind the spirit of religion. It gives them a great cover. It's very hard to come against. And then they use the tools of the Bible like forgiveness against you and all of these things. So I'd like to hear your story because I don't really know it from where it
Yeah.
started, how old you were. I'd love you to bring us into your story as early or however you feel comfortable with. I don't like to persuade that in any way. You start where you're comfortable.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just want to say too, I agree that, counseling's important. I definitely went to counseling and I think it's super important because for me, counseling and Christ went hand in hand. Like
Yes,
one I could not do one without the other. They were super important
that's
to me.
beautiful.
I promote both. So it's really great.
So do
My
I. I used to say, please meet me in that room, Jesus, because I don't know if that guy knows you would just meet me in that room because they're hard rooms. They're super
yeah,
hard rooms.
yeah, definitely. So my story really starts, I like to really go back all the way when I was like 5 years old. I have very large families on both sides. My mom has 8 brothers and sisters. My dad has 14 brothers and sisters.
Oh,
I grew up with
wow.
a lot of cousins. And when I was 5, right here in Lansing, Michigan, all of our houses were raided by the FBI. At the time was one of the biggest drug scandals in Lansing, Michigan. And all,
Wow.
yeah, all of my uncles and my grandfather went to prison. And my dad was not involved in any of that, so he was not sent to prison, not involved, didn't get in any trouble or anything like that with when it came to like what happened to his family. But then um, I would say what really sort of because it sucked growing up with my last name because of that, but what
Mm,
really started to like shift in my life was when I was sexually abused by 2 cousins. Um, and by the time I was 10 years old, and then when I was 12 years old, um, I our family moved from Lansing, Michigan to a little town called Vernon, Texas, where my dad received a pastoral position, and that was the reason why we moved. I think
mm.
it was a season where I feel like our family thought was gonna be really amazing. I think there was parts of it where it's like, you don't wanna move because 'cause you've already made your friends, your family's here, but also there's a part of the adventure part where it's like, you get to experience something new, you get to be in the
Maybe
heat.
somebody doesn't know my last name,
Yeah,
right?
that too, yeah. And
Right,
just, like, from that, even, like, the last name piece, like, getting that fresh start was really, like, a cool thing,
right.
but also, like, not being around the snow either. I was like, "Alright, like, this could be a good change." And what we thought was gonna be this incredible experience, which I will say it started off that way as far as like the church folks and the community was very nice and very acceptive, like accepting, and they received us and with love and care, and I that was really nice. But something happened as something switched very quickly because it wasn't long before my dad started to rape me, and
Oh my
it was a
God.
very, very dark season because not only am I being abused by my father, he's a pastor, and the way that our home was
Wow.
is our home was attached to the church. Like there was like a little hallway door that went into the church sanctuary, and then
Oh
it
man.
went to our home. So it was like a very small little hallway where there wasn't a lot of separation between my life, if that makes sense. Um,
Oh,
and so
100% it does.
yeah,
Well, kind of where I started, right? The spirit of incest that's behind the spirit of religion. There we go. You can't
yeah,
get any closer than that.
yeah. So it was definitely a very difficult time. And what ended up happening was, I always try to describe like what I was experiencing, like in the flesh. And something happened where it's like my emotions and feelings would only come to like a certain point. I didn't know this at
Mhm.
the time, but when the nights when he would come in my room, I would completely freeze up. And there would be times like the next day, I'd be like, wasn't I screaming? Like, why wasn't anyone coming to help me? Like, I'm in my mind, I'm thinking I'm
Mhm.
screaming and longing for help when really I was scared and froze up and just did what I was told to do. And so
Mhm.
what ended up happening was I have an identical twin sister, and I shared with my twin sister what was happening in my room. And the crazy thing is that I begged for this room. It was a very tiny, tiny room, because there was only it's like a two-bedroom house that was attached to, again, the church, and all three girls were supposed to share one big room, and my parents had the other. But I begged my dad that there was this little room because I'm older by 1 minute, and I was like, it doesn't matter. I'm still older. I get to have my own room. And they agreed. And even though it was tiny, like I had one bed on one wall, and the rest of the wall, my dad had built like these, like my closet was just like an open closet, and all I did was hang up all my clothes on the bars. Like I've always been a clothes girl. And so, what ends up happening, I told my sister what was happening. And if you can imagine, that's a very difficult thing for a 12-year-old to hear about her father. And,
Mhm.
what ends up happening is she ended up hiding in my room and saw everything that happened that night. And she,
Oh my
uh,
gosh, that was brilliant of you guys, actually.
there wasn't the plan. Actually, I didn't know she was in my room.
Wow.
She did that on her own, and she
What
was,
a godsend that she did this because now you have a witness. Most of the time, you don't have a witness in these crimes, Priscilla. That's remarkable. Keep going. I'm sorry.
oh, it's okay. So she ended up, she was the one that told my mom about everything, and I didn't know that till way later. But I would say even like my relationship with my sister changed. I think too, like at first, she didn't believe me until she sat in my room and saw everything. So I think on her end, maybe in whatever 12-year-old way, there was some guilt maybe that she felt that maybe she
Mhm.
could have spared me a night. I think obviously that was very traumatizing for her to see as well. And I think, I mean, what do you say to your sister? What do you say to someone after seeing something like that? Um,
So she didn't come to you after first witnessing that.
no.
And did she go to your mom immediately?
She did. She went to my mom the very next day, and that's when my mom found out. And, as much as I'd like to say, like, when my mom found out that we left, Vernon, Texas, and came back to Lansing, but that was, like, not the case. My mom ended up getting a counselor to come meet me at the church, and the day that she had the counselor come meet me, I don't know what it was, but I saw the lady and was just like, "I'm not talking to her." And, like,
Hmm.
she was sitting in the sanctuary, and as soon as I walked in, she tried to, like, hug me, but she had this overwhelming smell of, like, perfume. It immediately just, like, was a turn off for me and gave me a headache, but I also didn't know her. She was a stranger, but she's
Right.
also the place where I'm also being forced to still continue to lead worship. I'm a singer. I am still a worship director, and I
And how, yeah, 12, you were a worship
uh,
director?
yeah, my sister and I have sang since we
Oh
were
my
5.
goodness. I mean, it's
So,
beautiful to sing, but again, what a
yeah,
complicated world you just explained.
very, very dysfunctional family, and,
Hmm.
I think our family was just sort of, we just trained ourselves that whatever happened at home stayed at home. You
Right.
swept
Oh, it's the rules. It is
you
the rules of
living.
incest. And by the way, everybody listening that came through incest, myself included, I don't even question what you're saying because I lived it. I know exactly. You don't tell. You don't
Yeah,
tell. I mean, the people that you need to find, you don't tell because you are breaking every code of ethic in your family. Because it's a
yeah.
code of ethic and you got to be a good girl. We don't want to be bad girls,
Yeah,
right?
no, for sure. Especially like culturally too. I think just
Hmm.
being Hispanic, it was just kind of a known thing that whatever happens at home stays at home, and you cover your own. Like you cover your family. You
Let
submit
me
to your.
tell you, my father was a hillbilly. It was the same rules. He came
Yeah.
from the South.
Yeah,
He would actually say, what happens in this house stays in this house. He literally said that out loud in our home. So
yeah,
just so you know, it is a human condition too, that it's called grooming, love is what it's called.
for sure. For sure.
Right.
Um,
So did then the abuse stop after this?
so it did stop after that. What ended up happening was really
Wow.
we stayed for months after. I just got to a really dark place and
Oh, of course you
actually
did.
started hating my mom. because I was really confused on like why
Hmm.
we were still there. All I wanted was to come back to Lansing, Michigan. And we had lived in Lansing from when we were 2 years old, and now we're in sixth grade. So I just wanted to come back to like our church community, like our friends,
Hmm.
a place where people where I felt safe with. A lot of these people I didn't know, we just moved there. And I go back and I think about that season of my life often as far as like how far our family has come because at the time I really thought my mom was such a coward and I thought my dad was the most awful person in the world, and rightfully so for all of the experiences that took place under their roof. Because there were a lot of different things that happened in our home. I mean, just even seeing like my brother go through certain things, not sexually, but just like some of this, like my dad was in the army and he was very, very strict. And my brother just seeing some of the things he was going through. I also, we moved quietly. When I say quietly, we moved without telling people the real reason why we were moving because eventually we did move back to Lansing, Michigan. And we ended up moving in with an uncle who just got released from prison. So we're living in his basement. And
Oh,
it
wow.
wasn't long before another member who was being abused, and we ended up having to go, we got taken away.
So, oh, hold on a second. So, in your uncle's house in the basement, another child ends up being abused
Yeah.
because
And
incest runs in families, right? So, this is, I mean, it's a spiritual sickness. It's all kinds of sicknesses, but it's so common. It's so common. So, all right. So, you're in the basement and somebody calls on, was it somebody in your family or somebody in the uncle's family?
yeah, so it was someone in my family. And then I just remember I was leaving for school and I forgot my gym bag. I ran back down to the basement, and this individual told me that they were being abused too. And the thing
Uh,
is that they didn't even have to say like the full sentence. All they had to
you
do
knew.
actually was say my name. And I knew by the
Mhm.
look on their face that they were being abused too. And I was like,
Mhm.
not you too. And then that's when I really started to hate my mom. Like my mom and I really struggled during that season because as a child, I really felt like, why aren't you taking us away? Like, why aren't you doing
Well,
something?
that is the job of a parent. So that is a natural response to have as a child. It's a very
Yeah,
natural
for sure as a
response.
child. But when I became an adult, I really started to pray about how we got here, how my mom, who is a prayer warrior, an incredible person outside of making those decisions, she's a lovely person. Like, how did she get to a place where she didn't have the confidence to go on, live on, and move on
Mhm.
her own? Like, how did she make the decisions that she made? Like, why did she think these were the right decisions? Like, how did she justify them? And then I started digging into my father's history and his story, and like, how did my father, who's a godly man, full of the word, very charismatic, like, how did he go from always going to our sports and very strict and very, then I thought my dad was super strict. I will say there are some aspects where I'm very thankful for the discipline that we had in our home and certain structure pieces. But I started to wonder like how did he get to this place where now he's committing crimes and harm towards his towards his child.
Mhm.
And
Right.
so what ended up happening was I ended up hearing a sermon on the power of forgiveness at a youth camp.
So how old are you now? So let's go back in your story though. So you say the kids are removed from the house. Just and we'll get there in just a minute, but so the kids are removed and you're how old now when you go down in the basement and
We're
you
still
see this
12.
other.
We're just getting ready to
Oh,
return.
you're still
We're
12.
getting ready to turn 13. It was like 1 year. We
Oh,
were not there
wow. So
very
now you
long.
have, though, from 13 to 18, you still live with your parents?
Yeah. So
Okay.
at 13, I would say that's probably when like we were just getting ready to turn 13. So it was like not even like a full we were there for like 1 year in Vernon, Texas. So we moved back. We
Okay.
ended up getting taken away and we got to stay with like a family from our church. But what ended up happening was um
Oh,
Our
so you
mom,
got taken away from your parents.
we got taken away from our dad. So like my mom
Oh,
and
okay.
kids got to stay with a family member at the church, like a church family at the church.
Okay.
And
Got
so,
you.
but if you could just kind of think about, just obviously like the separation now has officially taken place as far as like us being separated by my father. My dad
Hmm.
was taken to jail. But what ended up happening was our mom ended up having a conversation and basically wanted us to not tell the judge about what took place. She wanted us to lie to cover our family,
Hmm.
because we've already lost so many uncles and my grandfather to the prison system. And so at the time, my twin sister was like really frustrated with me, because pretty much going up to like the courtroom, we rode up the elevator together when we were getting ready to get interviewed, and she asked me, she's like, "Are you going to lie to like the judge? Like, are you going to lie to the prosecutor or the caseworker or the people that are going to ask us questions on whether or not we're going to move forward with the case?" And at the time, I had no idea what I was going to do until I got up there.
Oh man, how difficult. This is so difficult.
It was. And it's very faint memory. Like I know what I
Hmm.
was going to do as far as like I know where I was going, where they're taking me, but the actual conversation is such a blur for me. Um, but I did end up telling them that it was a lie and that it didn't happen, and I did what I felt was right to protect my family. And so
Hmm.
we ended up moving into this
So
trailer home.
your twin lied as well.
So my twin didn't have to lie because she was not sexually abused by my
Oh,
family.
got you. Okay.
So
Got you.
they only asked her about what she experienced, not about what
Hmm.
she saw, because we
Oh,
weren't
I see.
safer
So
for my
it
kids.
right, it was lying by omission. She didn't, I mean, she didn't have to be forthcoming because she could just omit that part.
Yeah,
I
well,
get it.
and the case wasn't regarding me.
Yeah,
The case was
right.
regarding someone else.
Oh, got you.
Yeah. So
Right.
Um, that was a little difficult, which is why I love the work that we do, because there are in some states my sister would not be considered a victim because she wasn't physically touched.
Wow.
Trauma,
Wow.
even though
Just
she had,
exposed or what?
yeah, she
Yeah,
was exposed to a lot
right.
of trauma from what she saw.
Yep.
You know,
Right.
there are some states
Right.
that don't view her as a victim and a survivor, which she is. Um, but So what ended up happening is, yeah, so I lied to the judge to protect my family, which now looking back, I'm like, man, I often wonder like what my life would have been like, how different my life would have
Hmm.
been had I been honest. But thank God for his grace because he's always had his hand on me and my family. And what ended up happening is we just kept living life. I started to take my anger and bitterness out on sports, and anything that I could do to keep myself out of the house, I did. I had a job since I was 15 years old and even had to get special permission at 14 just to work here and there, because I just really wanted to be out of the house. And right at MSU, like,
Understandably so, love.
yeah.
Understandably
My aunt
so.
was like, "If you want to work, we can ask, like, I'll ask my boss if you guys can come and work here on the weekends." And, they basically were like, "You have to get special permission." And I was like, "Okay." One thing my dad and mom were not gonna say no to was us working. I really feel like our work ethic started off when we were very young. And I just did what I could to keep myself out of the house. But I also knew I just wanted a different life and I wanted more in life. Like, I'm thinking
Hmm.
at this point, this can't be my forever life. Like, to be abused sexually, I didn't want to be pretty. I didn't, honestly, I went through eating disorders where I would try really hard to like
Right.
make myself get bigger so people wouldn't think I was attractive because I thought that was like associated with being abused. There were
Right. That's very common, actually.
a lot of different things I went through.
Hmm.
And what ends up happening was I heard at a youth camp the first time I heard the story on the power of forgiveness. And then I heard Joyce Meyer. Joyce Meyer shared about her being raped by her father and how God
Hmm.
brought healing to her. And what I knew was that I wanted more, and I didn't want to be bitter and angry anymore. Not towards my mom for the choices she made, and not towards my dad for the decisions they made. And I told God, I said, God, I don't know what's all included in this forgiveness thing, what that really, really looks like. I've never seen forgiveness displayed where everything comes full circle. Like in my life, I hadn't seen that. But I just completely surrendered my life to him. And in college, I really just started to take my healing seriously. And I just told God, whatever you want me to do, like I'll do it, but I want to help people and I want to help people overcome. And I knew I couldn't do that until I overcame myself. And so I did a lot of hard work as far as going to counseling and therapy
Hmm.
and, really just setting good boundaries. And my story is not like others. I feel like, in the sense that I don't I don't expect for everyone to have the same outcome as I do. This is just something I chose for myself, as far as not only is my story one of the power of forgiveness, but it's also one of reconciliation, rehabilitation, restoration for both my parents. I really, really believe that forgiveness is mandatory of us. If we say that we are Jesus followers, it's mandatory for us to forgive, right? You have to forgive in order to be forgiven. That's what the word of God says. It doesn't say forgive if this person did this or did that. And so I knew that was the start for me. Reconciliation is completely optional. You can choose to reconcile or not reconcile with that person. I think there's a lot of different factors when it comes to that. But what ended up happening was I started to do the research of how did we get here? How did our family get
Yeah.
here? And I found out
Right.
that my mom was sexually abused by family members as well. She never
Hmm.
got the help she needed, so she couldn't offer the help that I needed. I think what ends up happening is people get
Right.
re-traumatized and they start to go back to their own experiences. And I'm sure there was an aspect of her where it's like, if I got through it, my daughter will get through it. I didn't get the help. I don't even know how to help her. And then I started to dig into my dad's family, and I found out that my grandfather raped him as well. And so I noticed that there's a lot of repeated cycles.
Oh, 100%.
And
Yeah.
so in the Christian realm, you'll talk a lot about generational curses. In the secular realm, you'll hear uh the cycles, the
Repeat. Yeah.
cycles. I don't care how you phrase it, but I know that it's truth on both sides, that when you don't get to the root cause of what happened to you, you will never bring healing. And I hear people all the time talk about how they want to end sexual abuse, they want to end domestic violence, they want to end gun violence. Well, you can't end any of those things without focusing on the ones who are actually causing the harm, who are the ones who are committing the crimes. Because if you're only focusing on just the victims, which they should have every resource, they should have everything that they need to heal. We should make sure the victims first are the first priority. But you can't focus on the victims only if you want to end cycles of crimes and cycles of abuse. You have to get to the root problem of why are people doing what they're doing and what happened to these people. What we've learned is that hurt people hurt people. I shared this hashtag over 10 years ago when I first shared my story, and a lot of people use it now. But a few years ago, I added something because I noticed that I don't want to necessarily use it and use hurt people as just an excuse, because it is real. When you're hurt, you do your best, but a lot of times we cause harm and hurt to others out of our own hurt. And I wanted to add that healed people heal people. And I noticed that the more I focused on my healing, the more my mom focused on her healing, and the more my dad focused on his healing, the more I could see a different picture. When you're healed, you hear differently, you see differently, you act differently, you walk differently. And now,
Right.
and I want to say too, like, me becoming aware of the cycles and the patterns of abuse and cycles of abuse and in my family, it's not to excuse any of the behavior. What my parents chose at the time were awful decisions. There's nothing that could ever excuse what my father has done for me. But what it does do is it gives me an understanding of like how we got here. And when you can get an understanding of how you got there, then you can start to work on a plan of healing. And I can confidently say that my mom and my dad are not the same people that they were when I was 12 years old.
Well, and that's kind of where I'd like to go back to in this is, can you tell me what the conversation, let's start with your dad. So you go and have a conversation, I assume, of forgiveness. What does that conversation include or look like for you both? You're sitting in this exchange. Kind of bring us into that a little.
Well, the first time was in a little Mexican restaurant in Texas when he was visiting me in college. And um, I was letting him know that I forgave him. And we'd had multiple conversations about like me forgiving him and just wanting to move on and move forward. But one of the conversations when we were talking about forgiveness and me now wanting to help other people, that was a lot more difficult than just the forgiveness conversation alone. When you're dealing with forgiveness and you know you've caused so much harm to someone, you're very grateful that that person is offering forgiveness, especially when it's not asked for and that's extended. I can tell you that even though my dad's not the same person he was when I was 12 years old, I know my dad lives a very quiet life now. He works hard, he minds his business. He knows that I do the work that I do. He's very supportive, but that's still very difficult for anyone to be like, I made this awful decision,
Right.
how this person's gonna be talking about it. Um, and so the first time when I shared with him, like the forgiveness pieces were just very heartbreaking. There was a time when my father came to I went to a Christian college, Nelson University, it was Southwestern Assembly of God University. Now it's called Nelson University. And I'll never forget, my dad, I didn't know my dad he was surprising me to visit me and we're in chapel and the sermon was yet again on forgiveness and God's mercy and grace specifically. And I remember just going to the altar and praying, and my dad put his arm around me when I was kneeling down, and he was kneeling down, and he just broke down crying. And I just knew that even though we'd had some of those conversations, that he was still dealing with a lot of guilt and shame. And
So did he speak to you the things that he did to you in those
as far as like
conversations?
the details,
Well, I mean, I'm sorry for raping you. Did he say that?
no, I don't think we've ever used that word, like in our conversations. And honestly, I don't need that or expect that. His apology to me for everything that he's done and him explaining some of the things that have happened in his family was enough for me. Maybe that's something that another victim or survivor would need, and I think that's fair. Yeah, I can say that my sisters and my brother and I were all very different, and what we've expected and needed from both our parents have all been very different. But that's not what I needed or wanted because my forgiveness wasn't to go in and for them to say they're sorry for X, Y, and Z. I didn't need that. I needed for God to heal my heart. He couldn't
Yeah,
bring
and
any
I
healing.
right. And I totally appreciate that and I get that. One of the things that concerns me a little bit in these situations is the children that are left behind us, right? So what measures are in place to make sure that the children, I love forgiveness. I believe wholeheartedly in forgiveness. I'm not going to let my grandkids go stay. My father's passed now, but I would
Yeah,
not ever let my children stay in his home overnight. So how do you guys deal with that just, in the way of keeping the children
yeah.
safe?
Yeah, so forgiveness doesn't mean that you sweep things under the rug. It doesn't mean that you don't use wisdom. It
I
means
love
that
that you say that.
you set up good boundaries. And I think it's important to know that you also have to know that the person has really repented and rehabilitated themselves. I feel like it's different if they're not owning their stuff and like they're not recognizing where they fell short and things like that. And I think that's why reconciliation was very different for us because he knew where he had failed. He knew where he had messed up. He had already lost his family, divorced. Like I could have easily chosen not to reconcile with my father, and that would have been absolutely okay. And first,
Right. You know,
my
I
siblings,
guess it just makes me think. I remember early in I'm 60 now, but I remember in my 20s and 30s going to my father. My father taught Bible studies. I have a hard time believing that he was a man of God because, he raped me for years and years. With all that being said, one of the things that I didn't do, and I think it's really important, and this is just my perspective, is I'd always come in and tell him I forgave him, but he never responded back to me in any way. But I always went away with the assumption of what I wanted, right? Like the assumption that he was accepting it. However, when I pushed him as I got older and farther in my healing, then I really saw when he was dying. It was interesting, Priscilla. I walked into his house and he said to me, what do you want with me? And I said, you know what, Dad, honestly, I don't need anything from you because his love included a whole lot of pain in my life. While I had moved past it so much, I do think actually, the opposite of expectation is really like I'm okay, right? So I was okay. And he actually said, you wait a lifetime for a love like that. So there was genuine softness and caring. Do I think my father was a changed man? I really don't know. I think it's God's job to determine that, but I wouldn't have let my kids there. So I just want to be really careful for the families that are listening. And I know your heart would do the same thing to be well seasoned and well wise in. We all want to go to this really place quickly that says let's just get this kind of out of the way because it's such an awkward thing. I know I was raped by my father too. It's an awkward thing, isn't it, to be by them and just know that there was that sexual intimacy. That feels odd, doesn't it? Does it to you? Or when you sat there, you know what I mean? And it's such a vulnerable place to sit in and offer forgiveness when we know it's there. And so we don't really want the exchange to last a long time. Does that make any kind of sense?
yeah, I definitely can understand that, but I do want to make it clear too. I have 11 nieces and nephews that, my dad is never alone with. Like I said, we don't lack wisdom, and we set
It's
up
awesome.
for everyone. We're grown adults, and so it's different for us to make decisions for ourselves, and we do everything we can to protect all the kids when they're in our home. My dad is never alone with any of the kids. And really that's not even just specifically to my dad, that's really specifically to all people that we don't just leave the kids with just random people. We're
Right.
protective because of our upbringing and things like that. They don't just spend the night anywhere. Things like, we're very, very particular. I don't have kids. I have 11 nieces and nephews. And I
That's
know
a
that
lot, though. That's beautiful. Yeah.
all the parents are very, very protective over the kids. And like I said, when we have holidays and things like that, everyone is in one space so that we're not dealing with anything like that.
I
And
love that because that's
right.
important, right? Because as you talked about, incest spreads out like a cancer in families. And the same thing was true of mine. And I really believe both of my parents were sexually abused as children as well. And so I get it. It's this cancer that spreads. And I honor forgiveness. I think it's hugely important. And I love that, to have these conversations, it's important. But
Yeah.
as you're saying, it's very important that we put up a stop sign for the children in front of us and say, nope, there's not going to be any blankets on the couch. You know what I mean? Like, I really thought I was doing that in my earlier years, but then I learned later, like my girls came to me and they're like, Mom, that cousin, when we were in there opening presents, there was a blanket. It's like, well, and like you say, you have to have that really strong wisdom. And having come through the same scenario, I didn't protect my children the way that I thought I was. And we're fine. I mean, we've continued to heal. I've all of that stuff, but they're hard conversations, like you said. They're really hard conversations. And I loved the one thing that you said is the more that you moved into healing, the more that they did. And I really believe that God is always looking at us, right? So even when we get to heaven, there's an accountability for each one of us. And so we can forgive our parents for 50 years and mean it with everything. And when they get to heaven, that does not take away the accountability that they'll have standing at the throne of God. And He has that accountability. So I think we're both saying that we can get on with our lives, right? Because that accountability stands 100% with God and they'll be accountable for that. Our forgiveness can't or doesn't take that away. Does that make sense? And I think that's
I think it's
a
important to also though recognize like who the forgiveness is for. Like forgiveness
yeah,
doesn't mean that they deserve to be forgiven. It just means that like you deserve to be free. And so clinging to
so true.
unforgiveness creates bitterness and anger and really actually starts to not just affect you as a person, but really like your mental health, like it messes with your even your spiritual walk with
I
Jesus. It messes
agree
with
completely.
you physically, it causes sickness in your body. And so one, it's important to know who it's for, but also it's really, really important to know to the more I got to know, I feel like and know the heart of Jesus, the more I can reflect him and be like him. And I think sometimes as Christians that we try to categorize sin and we're really good at talking about the murderer, the rapist, the thief, but I also feel like we're very quiet when it comes to like gossip and slander. And I feel like the consequences for sin are going to be very different. But the mercy and grace and salvation is available for everyone. The thing about what Jesus did on the cross, when he died for us, he made a way for every person to make it. That means the murderer, the rapist, the ones that we think shouldn't deserve forgiveness and mercy and grace, there are a lot of people that are in prison that are going to receive Jesus behind bars, and that's fine if they're there. But you have to think about the people that are not getting life sentences, whether they're pedophiles, murderers, whatever crime they committed, if they're not getting a life sentence, they are going to come back to our communities. And the questions we have to ask ourselves is how do we want them to come back out? If we want to stop cycles of crime, and these are the people committing the crime, what are we doing to rehabilitate? What are we doing to help them with their trauma? What are we doing to help them deal with themselves? I wish that counseling was mandatory in the prison. I wish that it was attached to their sentence. If they can't deal and figure out why they did what they did, then I feel like they should stay behind bars because then when
Mhm.
they don't get rehabilitated, they don't get the help they need, they don't get education, they
Right.
don't incentive programs to help them be better, they come back out and then they commit more crimes, causing more victims. And there's this vicious cycle, which is why I'm saying you've got
Right.
to
You
cover
see
those
it.
root
Yeah.
causes.
And I agree with you 100%. The first place, though, that you start with any rehabilitation or any repentance even means turn from something, right? That's what the word means. And so to me, accountability is so important. My children also were victims of this horrible crime. And the one thing I always told them was, forgive your father 100%. I believe in radical forgiveness. However, with that, both this is also a true statement. Make sure your father is accountable for exactly what he did for you. Because if he just says the whole "I'm sorry" or hold you, they were so manipulative that they got to rape you in the first place. They were so full of denial they got to rape you in the first place. So accountability is that very first step, the act of saying, "This is what I did to you." I really think it's hugely important, Priscilla, for the reason that rehabilitation is really there. I think the first thing that Jesus does in our hearts, and the reason why you and I can sit so vulnerable and talk about these things, is we know his love and forgiveness, right? And so we can easily accept, I accept my own things that I did as a result of the things that I had been through in life. And it's hard to forgive yourself for those choices and not
Yeah.
being the mom that I could have been because I was, doing all these horrible things to survive. So, but I had the first thing that I did to recover was take accountability, not for what my father had done, because I can't change any of that, but for how I was going forward in life. And I think the same thing is true for every human being that hits the planet. Nobody, you know what I mean? That's what I meant by our forgiveness can't help their accountability. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? And
Yeah,
so that was the
I think they're different whether it's in the natural or when we get to heaven. The beautiful thing is when we get to heaven, he remembers our sin no more.
well, and see, but here's the only reason I bring this up is what my father used to say, because my father knew the Bible just
Mhm.
almost as good as Satan, you know what I mean? And so he would come to us children because he had Bible study in the front and rape in the back. And he would actually say to us, "You guys can't use this against me because sins are forgiven and they're thrown as far as the east is from the west. That's biblical. Well, that's only if you're under the blood of God. And so, the blood of what Jesus did in that work on the cross, you have to
Yeah.
accept that. So, I'm always just super careful because I started this with the spirit of religion is what hides the spirit of incest. So, does that make sense? There to me there's this huge distinction. Like you even said our healing is not in the churches, but I think the churches that have the spirit of God in the truest sense understand, you know what I mean? But the spirit of religion is very sneaky. Satan doesn't want the guys that are out doing meth and all that. He wants the cleaned up people in church because you know what destroys people the most is to believe that I have God and I can rape you. I don't know. That's hard for me to comprehend. You know what I'm saying? So it that
Well,
it there
I think
there
the
there
enemy wants, I think I probably would just like disagree. Like, I don't know that
and
I
that's
wouldn't
fair.
think he
That's
wants
completely
just
fair.
the ones that are, doing it right. I think the enemy wants anyone that he can get. His
Oh,
entire
yeah.
is
100%. But
kill,
you know what I
steal,
mean?
and
He
destroy.
looks better. He looks better in a suit with a Bible in his hand, though. That's what I meant. And I'll make that a little bit clearer. I think Satan likes to show up with a great big suit on, a Rolls Royce, and a Bible in his hand. You know what I don't think that he really wants the addicts to show. He's already got the addicts in there going. And I love addicts, by the way. So I think we're kind of getting off course. But I think that the spirit of religion is not the spirit of the God of the Bible. And I do think there's a lot of mockery and deception around that if I just clean myself up, put on a Bible, I can do anything and I'm forgiven. And that's hard for me. My dad used those things against me. Does that make sense? I
Yeah, I
mean,
think
growing up, it was hard for
talking
me to
about,
decipher what God looked like because I grew up with a father who took my virginity and taught me about God.
yeah, I think though, like, I wouldn't compare like your father, like, and what he's done with you. And like, obviously, those things that he said to you were wrong. He used manipulation and the grooming to make you think and feel a certain way, which is so wrong and out of order on many levels. But when you're talking about the Father, like Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit, they're not capable of anything that's not good. Everything
Thousand,
attached,
100%, thousand
everything attached
percent.
to God is good. And everything attached to the enemy is evil. Again, his agenda is it's very clear in scripture. Kill, steal, destroy
Right,
by any means. And the enemy loves to destroy families and he loves to destroy us as individuals so that it keeps us from reaching our full potential. And this is the thing.
right.
I understand the accountability on this side of earth first in some ways. But there are many times when I meet with victims and survivors who've been affected by crime, especially when I speak at conferences that are in the church. There are many people waiting for that apology and that person to take accountability that they may not ever get. And if we have people waiting for accountability and we want accountability to look like X, Y, and Z, it's still keeping you in a certain place. Where my encouragement is to set yourself free and do all that you can do to heal for yourself, forgive for you, not because it's anything that they've done. You're not even saying what they done was right. You're not excusing it. You're not even saying that they deserve to be forgiven. There are some people that would probably agree with us that neither of our fathers deserve to be forgiven. But I deserve to be free. You deserve to be free. And so I try not to get caught up in a lot of the specifics of what I have to have this or I have to have that. If you get it, wonderful. My only concern is what happens when that person doesn't get that apology from the person that caused harm? What happens when that person doesn't get that accountability from that person? There's
Well, I
still,
think then, yeah, so my estimation of that is, and how my daughters and I chatted about, and I
yeah,
talked to my counselor, and I also believe it's biblical. I think that Jesus demands accountability. He does. I mean, if you don't come to him unless you accept what he tells you you have to do. So we can't take away accountability, and God brings accountability, right? So for me, I love my mother. My mother's still alive. I think what happens is your worlds, it's hard to mesh. And I bet you probably don't spend a lot of time with your father because it's difficult. Those are the things I'm saying. I believe, I think we're saying the same thing a lot. Forgiveness to me separates me from my abuser. And now all of a sudden I'm free to be who I'm supposed to be because abuse makes us so intermeshed and commingled that it's very hard for abused people to separate themselves from the abuser. The other thing that the abuser does is make sure that we're 100% focused on them. One of the coolest things I know that God taught me was, Jody, you see you. I was so focused on my abusers that I really wasn't living anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like I was focused on all these things, kind of like what you're saying. So I don't wait for anything anymore. I have left my full forgiveness with everybody. They know my number. They can reach out. It's easier for them also not to reach out to me because I think it's like you talked about being triggered and that sort of thing. But if I had accountability with my mother saying, I want to talk about these things and I want to be there, now I can really heal. If I don't have that, I don't know how I go forward with it because I feel like I have to be an inauthentic person and I'm not willing to do that anymore at my age. I don't have that much time left. I hope I have a lot of time left, Priscilla. Does that make sense? And I'm 60 now and I walked with them, my family, for a really long time. I tried really hard and it just didn't work because they were really on a different path than I was in some ways. And I had to keep my children, my grandchildren safe, so I family dinners and that kind of thing. But you see, I mean, when I stayed close, and your family could be very different. I just want to be super careful to the person listening. So many times, it takes a lot of growth, just like what you said in counseling, getting into counseling. Was in counseling 20 years, but I also witnessed a murder when I was very young with my father and all these things. And so for me, I think Jesus holds us accountable. I think that he mandates accountability to even come to him. We have to be accountable because, right, you first acknowledge there's no, you know, prayer in the sky or anything, but we do have to be accountable for our sin. And then we have to bring his redemption to that area. So, not that we have to get off on this, but it is important to me to keep families safe and completely not bring you can't bring hell with you, right? When God says we're going down this path now and I am going to stop this generational sin and we are not going to you can't bring hell with you. I love C.S. Lewis used to say that. And so for me, to make sure that I march on as the warrior that God has called me to be. And I do believe I have a ministry that's different only in the sense that if you knew me personally, I love bigger than most people ever know. And I know Jesus has been with me since I was a little girl. I mean, I met him when I didn't even know his name. And then my parents took me to this church years later, and I realized that this person that I met was Jesus. I really think he does want us to be free, Priscilla, in a very big way. And I think that abusers mandate that they be this huge person in our lives. And it's the family code of honor to honor them. I honor my parents, but I stay at a distance because it's safe for me. I feel much freer here. There's often times I want to pick up the phone and call my mom, and we're just such different people. Her vernacular hasn't changed. Does that make sense? And so it's hurtful. It's just like I'm constantly around this hurt. Does any of that make sense to you, or do you feel like
Yeah, I
all
think
of
that's
their
why I
language
said,
is
like, in the
different?
very beginning, like, victims and survivors, like, the forgiveness piece is mandatory for us to just
Right.
release.
And I agree with that. I do.
Reconciliation is optional, and you can choose whether to reconcile with your parents or whoever has caused you harm, because we're not, this could be any type of relationship or any type of hurt. But I also feel like
That's beautiful.
it's
That's a
also,
beautiful distinction to make. Yeah.
and I think that what you choose for yourself is what you should choose by setting whatever boundaries you want for yourself. You know your triggers. I think that it's also important though to like set up a good plan on what's going to happen when those triggers come. Because one thing I
I
do
agree.
feel like is there's two things that I think is a really important to say is that a lot of times we no matter what we're a victim of, we'll say, well, healing's a process. Forgiveness is a process. But I was seeing people say this for so many years and they were still saying it. And I'm thinking, like, well, you're in the same place you were 10 years ago. And although there's a lot of truth to healing's a process, forgiveness is a process, when I was praying, the Holy Spirit told me, when I was in my process, Priscilla, you choose though how long you want to be in this process. As much as this experience of being raped, whether someone has lost a child to murder, whether someone has caused harm to them, as unfair as it is, because it is unfair. Welcome to the enemy trying to get involved in your life. He doesn't play fair. But healing, as unfair as it is, healing is our own individual responsibility. And when I realized that, I realized the accountability, the expectations are no longer, for me, it was no longer on what they can do for me. It was what was I going to
Mhm.
do for myself and what was I going to allow Jesus to do in me and through me. Didn't matter what they did or didn't do. That's how far I've gotten in my relationship with God and in relationships where, it's a little easier to forgive now, but especially when you're dealing with other situations, but it doesn't mean that unforgiveness doesn't present itself to me. I still have to make a decision. Am I going to forgive my sister for talking to me this way, or do I need to ask for forgiveness for acting this way? But I also can't continue to use my triggers as an excuse and expect everyone to now change everything for me. I think that there should be some grace. There's seasons where people should be graceful and understanding that yes, this person just this is new to them. They just were abused. Let them heal. Let them go through the process. They're in the middle of counseling. But when I meet with people and I go and speak and I'm hearing over and over and over that people, for one, have never told a soul. 40, 50 plus 60 years. I just spoke
Right.
at an event last week. An 80-year-old woman who was abused by her father had never told anyone that she was abused. She's been hanging on to this for almost her whole
Mhm.
life,
Right.
which is why I really, really focus on how do we get as many people healed on the side of getting counseling. This is why I love my work so much because we
Yeah,
really
it's
hone in on
beautiful.
trauma recovery centers, really helping people with the trauma when they've been affected by crime. When you think about if you were a gun violence survivor and you've been shot with a gun, you're stabbed and you're bleeding. Where do you go to get help? Where do you go?
You go to the hospital
Go to the hospital. But
after
when
you call
you
the cops, I
yes,
hope.
but when you're mentally struggling,
Right.
where do you go?
Right. Well, you and I went to counseling in Jesus, right? And I still do. I mean, I don't go to counseling anymore, but yeah,
So that's why I love the work that we do because trauma recovery centers, which we're trying to get across the country, we just opened our first one up in Detroit, Michigan. Our second one's going to be in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And if I have it my way,
that's
the next one
beautiful.
will come to my city in Lansing. And it should be a place for a one-stop shop for every person who's dealing with trauma to be able to go and get the help that they need. For one, when you deal with your trauma and you get to the root, you can start working on yourself. Therefore, you're not going to cause harm and hurt to others. Now, I'm not saying that our organization or that my heart is just slap people on the wrist or that we don't believe in accountability or that we don't believe in consequences. There are a lot of people that are going to get saved and a lot of people are going to meet Jesus behind bars. And I'm okay with that. But there are also going to be a lot of people, like I said, coming back to our communities. I think that we have to focus on getting as many people as we can on both sides of it, whether you're causing harm or you're affected by the harm. We have to care about getting everybody healed. And this is the thing. We don't see a lot of those people who cause harm and do awful things. We don't see them as children of God. We see them for what they've done. And that takes the mercy and the grace out. And we have to see people the way that God sees them. And of course, we all have free will. People have to choose Jesus. They have to approve. I mean, they have to, choose whether or not they want to heal themselves. That they have to choose, do they want to better themselves? Do they want to stop the decisions that they're making? Anybody. That's how powerful Jesus is. Anybody can be redeemed and restored through the power of Jesus Christ. But it's if you choose him. And you have to
Right.
remember,
And
yeah.
I think and I agree with you because I mean I'm a born again spirit filled Christian. I agree with you. I guess I'm going to say this to the person like the 80-year-old woman who didn't talk. I
Mhm.
don't want an abused person to take up the cross and say it's my job now to go fix pedophiles. That to me seems like a huge that you just took my whole life from me and now it's my
Can you
job to go
explain that a
fix
little more?
people.
When you
Well,
pick up my cross, like, what do you mean?
well, my whole thing is take your eyes off the abuser and let God heal you, right? And let God take care of the abuser. There's other people that could be called to the pedophile.
You're
I'm a
saying
little I'm
have the
yeah, I'm a little
take the eye off the pedophile. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think the abused person needs to because mostly you're groomed, you are led into this life of denial by the abusers. So
Mhm.
then to get healed and put your eyes back on them to fix them, I'm really hard pressed to see that's good for us. Does that make sense? But God will have people that could reach out to pedophiles. The person that abused you is probably not your job to fix them. Does
Yeah, but
that
I've
make sense?
I've never said that I'm the one that fixed
Oh,
my father.
good.
No, I'm not the one that fixed my father, but I also feel like God can use anybody. And I'm not gonna
And I
let that,
agree with you. I guess I just for the listener want to say I'm not saying now to pick up a cross and go fix that pedophile that hurt you because I do think that it's really cautionary just because our
yeah,
whole lives were spent, looking at most of these people who are very much what's that word narcissistic, right? Like they make our world about them. And so that's all
yeah.
I'm
I
saying.
would
Just
Well, I would say
that
that it's not our responsibility to heal anybody but ourselves.
Yeah,
All of us, like,
100%
which
love.
is why I
That's
said
I
we
just
have to
and
take
I know
ourselves.
where your heart's coming from, but I just want to make sure that the listener isn't like because you know how sensitive we are. So many people like I just think about that. And actually on one of my social media, my daughter and I blog all the time. And the same thing this lady just said, I live in hell. I've never talked about this. They made me be quiet. So I'm just so cautious to heal those tender reeds, right? That they're such tender reeds. And you and I both know it because we both lived it. And so I do believe that God loves all people and his will is for all people to come to him and know him. I believe that with all my heart. But those Tinder reads, you guys just keep going out there. Don't don't stop and
Yeah.
start fixing pedophiles. You know what?
You would be
Or and if you're
surprised how
gifted
many
for it,
people actually, I mean, like I said, like even just hearing how Joyce Meyer, like even when she shared her story so many years ago about being raped by her father and how
Mhm.
God told her to not only buy her father a house, but then to move him into back into her house many, many years later, and how she helped him during his last
Yeah, I
days.
know the story.
Now, I know that's not the dislike, which is why I said from the beginning, I don't expect everyone's outcome to be like mine, but I can tell you that working with thousands of victims across the country, what victims want most is what happened to them not happen again. 8 out of 10 of victims and survivors actually believe through our surveys they want rehabilitation. They actually don't want to send people to prison for life. I think that
Oh,
sometimes see this
100%.
thing where
Because
people,
they don't have the kind of heart that the abuser had. You know what I mean? So I,
yeah,
I think that's very true. I don't think that people come out and want to hate or be unforgiving. They want to be safe. They want to be free, but those now they're burdened with years and years of reliving memories and those kind of things because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to heal. That's just the truth of the situation, right? And that's why I think it's interesting if you go to Christmas dinners all the time with people. And I know Joyce Meyer's story, and I thank God for her all the time. I also remember a time where she came back and said, "I know God's telling me to tell the detail of my story." I don't know if you heard that, but I did hear when she did say that, and she told more detail. And she said, "I was raped 117 times. I can't remember now, but my mom would leave me here." I thought it was very interesting that as she got older, this was maybe 3 years ago or something, and she said, I know God's moving me into this. I think the reason why that's so important is that it's not just a one and done, that God steps back in and heals you. It is over and over, time and time again. When you're raped many times like that, I can't remember how many times, but it was in the hundred, it was just, it was three digits for sure. that just doesn't, you know what I mean? It's not just a one time God stops by and you're good. That's just not how healing really works, not even in the kingdom of God. And he wants to go back in those instances. I'm not saying he has to go back 100 and whatever times, I'm not saying that. But there are times, you know what I mean? Like where you're triggered and you'll have a memory of something like, my mother and father did when I was 17, they did this horrible thing on this trip. I wasn't even reminded of that, Priscilla, until like 3 years ago. And at that time, I need him to come back. And so that's the thing that I think we have to be really careful for is that he's always available for when those things come back because like I read, I can't think Beth Moore's book, and she was like, I healed and I'm good. What happens when you're triggered when you're 63? I think the same God's right there for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are over time, but I could talk to you for hours. I love your heart. I think it's beautiful what you're doing. How old are you now?
I'm
I
39.
think you're 39. I just love that the work that you're doing. I just pray God's blessing over your life. Just can carry on. I hope that we can do this again. I love chatting with you. I want everybody to go to your organ. Tell the organization again. I think it's really cool work you guys are doing.
Yeah, it's called cssj.org. So it's Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice.
That is so beautiful. Priscilla, thank you so much for being here tonight. God's blessing. And remember, everyone out there, you take your eyes off the abuser. God's looking for you to heal you. Love you all and extra protection to you this week, Priscilla.
Thank you. Nice
Thank
to meet you.
you. Nice to
Bye.
meet you.